Roughly 14% of all Americans report German heritage, making it the single largest ethnic group in the United States. Larger than the 11.6% who claim Irish ancestry, and even larger than the 9.8% who link themselves to England, the country the 13 original colonies separated from. The specific reasons so many Germans came to the United States varied from wave to wave of immigrants, but the general reasons were the same as other large groups. They were escaping. Many were war refugees. Others were fleeing religious persecution, but the shared experience of the vast majority of Germans who came to America was that they were running away from problems far more than they were running toward opportunities in the New World. And the start of the centuries of war and religious persecution that ravaged Germany arguably started not in Germany, but in England, specifically at Oxford University. John Wycliffe was a Catholic seminary professor at Oxford in the 14th century. He advocated translating the Bible into more common language, saying, quote, "The laity ought to understand the faith, and since the doctrines of our faith are in the Scriptures, believers should have the Scriptures in a language familiar to the people, and to this end the Holy Ghost endued them with the knowledge of all tongues." He also advocated looking to Scripture rather than church tradition, saying, quote, "The gospel alone is sufficient to rule the lives of Christians everywhere. Any additional rules made to govern men's conduct added nothing to the perfection already found in the gospel of Jesus Christ." He did not believe in the practice of confession, writing that, quote, "Private confession was not ordered by Christ and is not used by the apostles." And as to indulgences for the forgiveness of sin, he wrote, "It is plain to me that our prelates in granting indulgences do commonly blaspheme the wisdom of God." He believed instead that Christians should, quote, "Trust wholly in Christ, rely altogether in his sufferings, beware of seeking to be justified in any other way than by his righteousness. Faith in our Lord Jesus Christ is sufficient for salvation." Unsurprisingly, these teachings brought him to conflict with Pope Gregory XI. On May 22, 1377, a papal bull was issued and sent to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Bishop of London, King Edward III, and the Chancellor of Oxford University denouncing Wycliffe's teachings. For a time, Wycliffe was placed in confinement at Oxford, but before excommunication hearings could proceed, Pope Gregory died, and Wycliffe was released. Wycliffe continued to criticize the Catholic Church, writing rejections of the idea of transubstantiation, saying, quote, "The nature of the bread is not destroyed by what is done by the priest. It is only elevated so as to become a substance more honored. The bread, while becoming by virtue of Christ's words the body of Christ, does not cease to be bread. When it has become sacramentally the body of Christ, it remains bread substantially." Followers of Wycliffe's teachings were derogatorily called Lollards, but most took the name as a badge of honor. New excommunication hearings were held in 1382, but they failed. However, Wycliffe died of a stroke just a few years later, in 1384. But Wycliffe's ideas reached a teacher at the University of Prague by the name of Jan Hus, who was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1400. In 1401, he was promoted to the Dean of Philosophy department at the university, and a year later he was made a rector. Although the Catholic Church had banned Wycliffe's writings, Hus had translated some of them and helped distribute them to the university. When word got back to Rome on June 24, 1405, Pope Innocent VII directed the Archbishop of Prague to end teaching of Wycliffe to the school and forbid any further attacks on the clergy. In 1406, two students brought a document to Prague with the seal of Oxford University that praised Wycliffe, and Hus read the document from the pulpit. In 1408, Pope Gregory XII issued a warning that he had heard of heresies, and the Archbishop and King of Bohemia ordered all of Wycliffe's writing to be surrendered for, quote, correction. Hus complied. However, also in 1408, a papal schism emerged, with two men both claiming the papacy. The local archbishop remained loyal to Gregory, but Hus and his supporters only pledged neutrality. This meant many leave the university, some going on to found a new university in Leipzig. When the archbishop died in 1411, Hus spoke more openly and aggressively in opposition to indulgences, as those making claims to be the real pope had been attempting to raise money for the Crusades against one another. In 1412, Hus gave a lecture against indulgences that was more or less word for word a translation of Wycliffe's writings. Hus went on to argue that no one, not bishops or even the Pope himself, had a right to call for violence in the name of the Church, and that he would instead pray for his enemies. His supporters began to burn the papal bulls calling for indulgences to fund the Crusades. As a result, 3 men were beheaded for condemning indulgence. Hus declared that Bohemia should be free of papal control, and as Wycliffe argued, the state and not the Church should rule. He wrote, quote, "Even if I should stand before the stake which has been prepared for me, I would never accept the recommendation of the theological faculty." Hus's ideas were popular throughout Bohemia, and so on the 18th of October of 1412, he stated that he appealed to Jesus Christ as the supreme judge rather than the Catholic Church. In January of 1413, a general council in Rome condemned the writings of Wycliffe and ordered them burned. Hus was called to stand trial in the city of Constance in 1414. When he arrived on November 3rd, he proceeded to preach in direct violation of church decrees. On November 28th, he was imprisoned, and on December 4th, 3 bishops were assigned to conduct an investigation of him. His trial did not begin until June 5th, 1415, and it continued on June 8th. All the while, Hughes refused to recant many of his teachings. On July 6th, 1415, the Council of Constance wrote, quote, "This holy synod of Constance, seeing that God's church has nothing more that it can do, relinquishes Jan Hus to the judgment of secular authority, and decrees that he be relinquished to the secular court. He was condemned to death and burned at the stake. As he was tied naked to a stake, with wood and straw piled up to his neck, he was given one last opportunity to recant. Instead, his last words were reportedly, quote, 'God is my witness that the things charged against me I never preached. In the same truth of the gospel which I have written, taught, and preached, drawing upon the sayings and positions of the holy doctors, I am ready to die today.' And the council declared that Wycliffe himself was a heretic. This led to his body being exhumed, burned, and thrown into a river by the church in 1428. But the death of Hughes was not the end of his movement. In 1419, a group of his followers who came to be known as the Hussites engaged in what came to be known as the First Defenestration of Prague, throwing town leaders from windows to their death in the streets below. Soon after, the King of Bohemia died, and the Hussite uprising led to many German Catholics being driven from the area. This was the start of the first so-called Hussite Wars, with the Catholic Church calling for a series of crusades into Bohemia to put down rebellions. The first four all ended in failure for the Catholic Church. As a result, the Hussites were emboldened to launch raids into neighboring territories, attempting to make alliances with some from Poland and Lithuania. The intent was to deter neighbors from joining the largely Catholic German forces, but these raids had almost the opposite effect. When peace negotiations failed on August 1st, 1431, a fifth crusade was launched. Although the Hussites were able to fight the Catholics off militarily, it led to internal conflicts, which caused the decline of the Hussites. In 1434, a fight broke out between two Hussite factions. Utraquists were more moderate and still held to many Catholic traditions, whereas Taborites were very radical and wanted to have a complete overthrow of the church. The Utraquists were able to defeat the more radical faction and were ready to negotiate a peace and a kind of reconciliation with the Catholic Church. This led to a peace treaty being signed on July 5th, 1436. In 1457, some of the former Taborites who rejected reunification with the Church went off on their own path spiritually. They became known as the Moravians. They were inspired not just by Huss and Wycliffe, but also by the teachings of a pacifist scholar by the name of Petr Trzecki. He wrote, quote, "Wars and other kinds of murder have their beginning in hatred of the enemy and in the unwillingness to be patient with evil. Their root is in an intemperate self-love and in a moderate affection for temporal possessions. These conflicts are brought into this world because men do not trust the Son of God enough to abide by his commandments." A leader of the early Moravian Church described them as, quote, "People who have decided once and for all to be guided only by the gospel and example of our Lord Jesus Christ and his holy apostles in gentleness, humility, patience, and love for our enemies." In 1466, the peace began to fall apart when Pope Paul II excommunicated the Hussite king of Bohemia. 2 years later, the King of Hungary called for the invasion of the area under the pretext of returning the kingdom to Catholic rule. He was able to capture much of the land of the south and east, but never Prague itself. While that invasion ended in 1478, stability was still an issue as demonstrated by the Second Defenestration of Prague on September 24, 1483, when once again Prague town leaders were thrown out of windows to their death by Hussites. A true peace between the Hussites and the Catholics didn't emerge until a treaty was signed in 1485 that was affirmed again in 1512. All of this violence and unrest ravaged the region. The estimated population before all of these things happened was between 2.8 and 3.4 million people. After, it was down to between 1.5 and 1.9 million people. In 1483, Martin Luther was born in a town about 60 miles from the city of Leipzig, the city where those who had left Prague during Huss's time had built their new university. Luther's father wanted his son to become a lawyer, sending him away to Latin schools in the area, and he eventually enrolled in the University of Erfurt in 1501. After receiving a master's degree in 1505, he enrolled in law school as his father wanted. But on July 2nd, 1505, while returning home from school after a trip home, he was struck by lightning. He told his father that when it happened, he cried out, quote, "Help, St. Anna! I will become a monk!" Reportedly, he viewed this exclamation as an unbreakable vow, and he left the university to enroll in St. Augustine's monastery in Erfurt a few weeks later. His father was furious, but his son had made his mind up and told his friends who attended his farewell dinner, quote, "This day you see me, and then not ever again." In 1507 he was ordained, and in 1508 he began teaching at the University of Wittenberg. In 1512 he was not only awarded a Doctor of Theology, but became the chair of the theology department at the university. In 1515 he became a provincial vicar, traveling the region to visit and oversee 11 separate monasteries. Sometime during this time in his studies, Luther came to believe that indulgences were not justified by his reading of the Bible. In 1516, a Dominican friar by the name of Johann Tetzel came to Germany in order to sell indulgences to raise money for the restoration of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Tetzel was reportedly known to say to potential buyers, quote, "As soon as the coin in the coffers rings, the soul from heaven springs." Luther wrote a protestation to a local bishop of this practice. Included in the letter was a copy of an argument against the practice that he had prepared, which he titled, "Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences." This letter contained what has come to be known as the 95 Theses. Most scholars do not believe that Luther intended to confront the bishop of the church directly by doing this, and that he seemed to instead be trying to start a scholarly discussion of the matter. Most historians also believe the idea of him nailing the questions to the door of the church is simply a myth. But this isn't to say that the questions he asked were not confrontational. For example, the 86th thesis asked, quote, "Why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, build the Basilica of St. Peter with the money of poor believers rather than with his own money?" The archbishop himself did not respond to the letter, but instead forwarded the theses to Rome in December of 1517. Over the next 3 years, envoys were sent from the church to convince Luther to recant his writings, as they began to be spread and translated. But Luther refused. On June 15, 1520, a papal bull was issued threatening him with excommunication if he did not recant within 60 days. Luther publicly set fire to the papal bull on December 10, 1520. He was excommunicated less than a month later, on January 3, 1521. In times past, this likely would have meant the immediate end of Luther, but the Holy Roman Empire, where Luther resided, was going through changes. Centuries later, Voltaire would famously say of the Holy Roman Empire, quote, "This agglomeration which was called, and which still calls itself the Holy Roman Empire, was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire." Although there was no promise of hereditary rule, the last two leaders had been of the Habsburg dynasty, and Maximilian I had actively arranged political marriages over the decades that had set up to inherit all of the Spanish Empire, much of Italy, and large parts of Austria and Burgundy. As Erasmus of Rotterdam put it, quote, "You, noble Prince Charles, are more blessed than Alexander the Great. He, for his part, had seized an immense empire, but not without bloodshed. You were born into a splendid empire. You owe it to heaven, and your empire came to you without the shedding of blood, and no one suffered for it." But Charles himself was actually not from any of the places he was set to rule. He had been raised in Belgium speaking French and Dutch, and had not yet learned Spanish or German. While his father was still leading the Holy Roman Empire, in 1516, Charles became the King of Spain. Spain during this time had just begun the conquest of the New World, which brought him great wealth, but his not being Spanish also caused uprisings against him as a foreign ruler, which limited his actual power over the Spanish Empire. This was also combined with distance that left his orders to the New World largely ignored. In 1519, when his father died, Charles was just 19 years old. Transfer of the title of the Holy Roman Empire had to be approved by Catholic electors, and the King of France contested his application. Therefore, in order to keep the emperor title, Charles had to more or less outbribe the electors. Because of this, even with the huge wealth coming in from the New World to Spain and his family connections, he still took power deep in debt. The fight over the emperor title also ensured he had a lifelong enemy in the King of France, with whom he would engage in several wars, the first starting in 1521 when France invaded Burgundy. And this was all before even discussing the looming Ottoman Empire to the east, which would soon invade. All of this is to say that Charles V had many issues beyond Luther's alleged heresy, which demanded his attention as he took the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. Still, Charles V called an imperial diet, a kind of formal assembly to meet in the city of Worms, to pressure Luther to conform to church law. Luther arrived in Worms on April 16, 1521, and appeared before the assembly in the late afternoon on April 17th. The presiding officer was a German Catholic theologian by the name of Johann Eck. Eck presented a list of books that Luther had authored that had been deemed heretical by the church, and asked if he was willing to renounce them. Luther asked for a day to provide a proper answer, and this delay was granted. When Luther returned on the 18th, he reportedly said, quote, "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, for I do not trust either in the Pope or the councils alone, since it is well known they have often erred and contradicted themselves, I am bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. May God help me, amen." Eck reportedly compared Luther's actions to those of Jan Hus, inferring that, like Hus, Luther was a heretic. But Luther was not immediately arrested, as the assembly wished to continue to confer in private to decide what to do with him. He left Worms to return to Wittenberg, but on the way a group of men dressed as highwaymen abducted him. Fortunately for Luther, this had been planned in advance by a friend of his in order to get him into hiding at Wartburg Castle. When the assembly at Worms presented their recommendations to Charles V, on May 25, 1521, Charles issued an edict declaring that Luther was a heretic and an outlaw, stating, quote, "We want him to be apprehended and punished as a notorious heretic." Luther spent much of the next year in hiding, but continued to work. He translated the New Testament from Greek to German and continued writing attacks on indulgences and pilgrimages. He also expanded his attacks on formal mass and confession. In time, Luther secretly returned to Wittenberg, giving sermons as he believed his writing was insufficient. He wrote to a friend, quote, "During my absence, Satan has entered my sheepfold and committed ravages which I cannot repair by writing, but only by my personal presence and living word." But some of Luther's followers went beyond words and teachings. One of his followers was a man by the name of Thomas Munzer, who gave weekly sermons that could reportedly draw near 2,000 people. Beyond the Catholic Church's concerns, even Luther was requesting to come and meet with Munzer. When his followers burned a small pilgrimage in 1521, Munzer was called before the Duke, and he responded with a sermon where he said, quote, "What a pretty spectacle we have before us now, all the eels and snakes coupling together immorally in one great heap. The priests and all the evil clerics are the snakes, and the secular lords and rulers are the ears. My revered rulers of Saxony, seek without delay the righteousness of God and take up the cause of the gospel boldly." Luther condemned Munzer in the stirring rebellion, writing that Munzer should be banished. Munzer fled, but he would reappear in 1525, first preaching without permission before helping to organize what would become a peasant rebellion. Luther came down firmly in defense of the local authorities, many of whom had provided him protection from the Catholic Church, but the ideas of the oncoming Reformation had progressed beyond Luther's ability to control them. The peasant uprising failed, with estimates of between 70,000 and 75,000 deaths, but it was a wake-up call to the ruling class. Luther's condemnation of the uprising, combined with him also becoming more moderate in his views generally after the uprising, made him a far more acceptable option relative to the alternatives. By 1526, Catholic Church leaders seemed to accept that it would not be able to arrest him without a war, and resigned to allowing Luther's teachings in German territories to continue, so long as the more radical teachings did not. The Church attempted to reverse this decision in 1529, but by 1530, what would become known as the Lutheranism was widespread, along with other early Protestant church movements elsewhere across Europe, particularly in German-speaking areas with access to Luther's teachings and writings. And other world events were taking much of the attention of Charles V and the Vatican. Starting in 1526, the Ottoman Empire had invaded in the east, going so far as attempting a siege of Vienna in 1529. By the 1540s, the Ottoman Empire controlled much of central and southern Hungary. Even more directly for the Vatican, Charles V's forces had sacked Rome in 1527. Although Charles had only intended the troops to blackmail the Pope into compliance, as often happened during his reign around the world, his actual control was limited, and therefore his orders were ignored. His army of mercenaries, tiring of waiting for payment, instead ransacked Rome and eventually took the Pope prisoner, holding him for ransom. With all of this going on, other issues were certainly of greater focus to the Church than Luther and Lutheranism in Germany. German Lutherans created a military force called the Skalkalmik League, named after a town where they were founded in 1531, but they had taken no offensive action because of a negotiated peace with the Catholic leaders in 1532. Eventually, the various wars and conflicts stabilized, and Charles V and the leadership in Rome turned their attention back to Lutherans in Germany. They held the Council of Trent in 1545. This is generally considered to be the start of the Counter-Reformation movement, when the Catholic Church affirmed their positions in opposition to Lutheranism and Protestant movements generally. In June of 1546, Pope Paul III made an agreement with Charles V that said in part, quote, "In the name of God and with the help of the assistance of his papal holiness, his imperial majesty should prepare himself for war and equip himself with soldiers and everything pertaining to warfare against those who objected to the Council of Trent, and against the Small Keg League, and against all those who were addicted to the false belief and error in Germany, and that he do so with all his power and might in order to bring them back to the old faith and to the obedience of the Holy See." That same year, in 1546, Martin Luther died. German Lutherans, believing they had to take the initiative before Charles could assemble his army, occupied the Catholic town of Heusen, hoping to force invaders to move into Bavaria. But they waited too long before taking next steps, and Charles was able to bring his army up from Italy. As a result, German Lutherans were routed. Charles had beaten the armies, but that didn't mean he could control the people who lived there. War broke out again in 1552. In 1555, rather than continuing the fight, the Peace of Augsburg allowed Lutheranism to continue under the principle of each prince being able to choose to be Catholic or Lutheran, using a phrase which translated from Latin means, whose realm, his region. Each leader was no longer allowed to convert without also resigning. While this did produce a loose short-term peace, the two sides were still at odds on key issues, but this was only looking at it from the Lutheran and Catholic lens. In 1582, the peace was broken when the Prince-Elector of the German city of Cologne converted to Calvinism and refused to resign, instead calling for parity between Calvinism and Catholics. After a protracted war that led to the sacking of several cities, the prince was defeated and a Catholic was installed in his place. But in these early days, at least relative to other areas, German emigration within Germany and within Europe was still safer than traveling transatlantically, and so the push to leave rarely outweighed the risks of traveling to the New World, particularly in any kind of large numbers. But there were some Germans in the early colonies. In 1607, a German physician-botanist by the name of Johannes Fleischer came to Jamestown and was reportedly the first continental-born European to arrive at the settlement, as well as the first university-educated person. He reportedly came to the English colonies in search of new materials for medicine, but died after only about a year in the colonies. While we can't be 100% certain of his cause of death, poison is likely a good guess given his epitaph reads, "He surveyed what the German soil produced in terms of plants. When in America flourished, he viewed, too, and thereby perished." Back in Germany around the same time, the Protestant and Catholic leaders were forming coalitions known as the Protestant Union and the Catholic League, and as the Protestant power grew, with it also grew resentment at the Habsburg dynasty and its Catholic rulers. This sparked off what came to be known as the 30 Years' War. During this war, it's estimated between 4.5 and 8 million people died, not just from high casualty rates, but also starvation and disease. Prior to the war, estimates were that there were between 18 and 20 million people living in the area that encompassed the Holy Roman Empire in about 1600. By 1650, it was down to between 11 and 13 million. While most of the refugees had no way of making the transatlantic travel, those who have skilled labor were sought after in the New World. Some were able to find passage, new opportunities in the newly established colonies, and not just the English colonial colonies, but also in Dutch New Amsterdam. As early as 1632, small numbers of German Catholics were documented as arriving in western Maryland. But as most Germans tended to be peasants with limited education and resources, these were exceptional cases and not a regular passage in large numbers. But things changed when in 1677, a group of Quakers that included William Penn bought land in what is now western New Jersey. Some of this land was claimed by Sweden and then taken by the Dutch, but following the taking of New Amsterdam by the English in 1673 and the Treaty of Westminster in 1674, the land's inhabitants were now under the British Crown. On February 28, 1681, in order to pay off a debt to William Penn's father, Charles II granted a land charter. Penn proposed that the new land be called New Wales. This request was denied, so he recommended the name Sylvania. The king disregarded this and named it Pennsylvania, in honor of Penn's father. This was a name that the younger Penn was reportedly embarrassed by, fearing that people would think he named it after himself. The land that was granted was more or less the area that makes up the states of Pennsylvania and Delaware, although Penn would later allow Delaware to govern itself. Penn was a Quaker and had traveled in Germany for many years between 1671 and 1677, converting Germans to the Quaker faith. Penn welcomed entire congregations to come to his new land, meaning German refugees wouldn't be traveling alone to a place where they didn't speak the language, but instead would be moving an entire congregation to set up German communities. In 1683, a German-speaking settlement was established just outside of Philadelphia, mostly by Dutch Quakers and Mennonite families fleeing the Swiss Confederacy. This came to be known as Germantown, but was eventually enveloped by Philadelphia itself. The first mayor of the town jokingly referred to it as Armentown, which is a German-English way of saying poor town, but eventually the settlement became quite prosperous. Even as the community became more prosperous, they maintained religious convictions around things like slavery. They were among the first groups in the colonies to write critically of slavery, stating in a formal proclamation in 1688, quote, "Although they are black, we cannot see why it should be more reasonable to keep them as slaves instead of whites." Having a German-speaking community established just outside the port of Philadelphia, combined with the promise of land and continual fear of religious wars, German immigration to the colonies began to grow. The native people of this region, the Lenape, had been ravaged by diseases brought from the New World. Penn, unlike most Europeans, generally honored the treaties with local indigenous people and agreed to purchase land rather than simply occupying it. Penn signed the Treaty of Shakamaxon, stating the two people would, quote, "live together in peace as long as the creeks and rivers run and while the sun, moon, and stars endure." During Penn's lifetime, the relations with native groups in the region was so peaceful that Pennsylvania didn't even require a military force, unlike all of its neighbors. While his own Quaker beliefs were in opposition to the Lenape, Penn was a true believer in religious freedom. Penn also declined to aid the New England colonies in their fight with native groups there, citing Quaker pacifism. This belief in religious freedom also extended to non-Quakers coming to Pennsylvania. While Penn was governor, Pennsylvania's government had few taxes and little debt, making it a welcome destination for settlers generally, particularly for refugees from Protestant religious minorities in mainland Europe who could earn jobs as skilled labor. Between 1688 and 1714, Germany was subject to a series of invasions, leading to wars raging across the Palatinate region of Germany. In 1709, 13,000 farmers from the Palatinate region of Germany were encouraged to travel to England in hopes of getting passage to the new colony with promises of land. Many were turned back, particularly Catholics, but some were able to make the crossing. The largest was a group of about 3,000 who ended up in New York City, before dispersing from there into upstate New York and New Jersey, with others moving south to connect with the already existing German settlements in Pennsylvania. Many were sent as redemptioners, a status even worse than indenture, as rather than the agreement being made before the emigrant left, they would take out a loan without a specific term from the owners of the ship transporting them, and on arrival that loan would be sold to a wealthy landowner who had all the leverage in labor negotiations as to how long it would take to pay off the debt. A person living at the time described it this way: adult persons bind themselves in writing to serve 3, 4, 5, or 6 years for the amount due to them, but their young people, from 10 to 15 years, must serve until they're 21 years old. It often happens that parents and children, after leaving the ship, do not see each other again for many years, perhaps no more at all in their lives. This influx of German immigrants drew to a point that an entirely new dialect of German eventually developed that came to be known as Pennsylvania Dutch. In upstate New York, some of the poorest refugee families were granted land by Native American groups in what was then some of the deepest frontiers of the territory in the Mohawk River Valley. These were the first Europeans and native people of that area had agreed to allow settle that far west, and while this was done in the stated interest of charity, it was also likely in an effort to stave off the British habit of simply granting land without payment to native peoples, by creating a buffer zone, as disease and war continued to ravage the Native American communities. And the British, of course, preferred this buffer zone be occupied by poor German refugees, as it protected them both from the French and native hostilities. To the surprise of both the Native Americans and British, relationships between the native groups and the Palatines was far less confrontational than any experienced by other settler groups from Europe. One Palatine leader reported saying of the Iroquois League members in the area that we intend to live our lives together as brothers, and there appeared to be a mixed use of churches between both groups as well as intermarriage. Land agreements were often rental rather than purchase in nature, with the Palatines giving food and livestock as tenant farmers, much like they had as peasants in Germany. In Virginia, two groups of immigrants began arriving, one in 1714 and one in 1717, founding a colony called Germania in what is now Culpeper, Virginia. From that colony, 12 families left to form Germantown, Virginia, and having establishments, even more Germans came to the area. Another group of Germans ended up in Georgia, helping to build Fort Frederica, along with English and Scottish, who James Oglethorpe recruited in his effort to build a colony out of the, quote, worthy poor. Once again, the British were happy to have them as a buffer between other colonies and Spain, hence the need to build a fort so quickly. Outside of the English colonies, Germans also migrated to French Louisiana starting as early as 1718. A Jesuit priest traveling in the area wrote, quote, these 9,000 Germans who were raised in the Palatinate, Alsace part of France, were in Arkansas. The Germans left Arkansas en masse, they went to New Orleans and abandoned passage to Europe. The Mississippi Company gave the Germans rich lands on the right bank of the Mississippi River about 25 miles above New Orleans, the area now known as the German coast. These settlers tended to adapt to speaking French rather than setting up German-speaking enclaves and largely merged with the French Acadians and Cajun culture generally. These German immigrants are believed to be the source of accordions and Cajun music. In Pennsylvania around this time, in 1718, William Penn passed away, leaving his sons to inherit his holdings. Penn had been well respected by the native people for his honesty, but the sons were not the father. Penn's children on several occasions claimed that the Lenape had conceded some land to their father in earlier negotiations that they had not. The most egregious example occurred in 1737 when they claimed a 1686 treaty gave them land rights in the Lehigh Valley. This treaty came to be known as the Walking Treaty, as the language stated expansion as far west as a man could walk in a day and a half. Although the Lenape leaders had no records of it, and the documents given to them were most certainly a forgery, in order to avoid conflict, they agreed to what they thought was a very limited land expansion. But in reality, by signing the treaty, they had conceded more or less the entire Lehigh Valley, an area of 1.2 million acres. Many English-speaking colonists also began to view German immigrants with disdain and racism. Ben Franklin wrote in 1551, quote, why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements, and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens, who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? But the conditions in Germany dictated that more refugees would continue to come. One group in particular that we mentioned earlier was the Moravians. The Moravians had been able to maintain enclaves for over a century after Han Hus's death, and were now beginning to implement what many believe was the first large-scale Protestant missionary movement, sending missionaries not just to colonial America but around the world. In 1740, they attempted to establish a mission in upstate New York near the already established German settlements, but their attempts to convert Native Americans brought suspicion that they were secretly Catholic Jesuits in alliance with the French. That led the colonial government of New York to order them expelled in 1744. Moravians had more success in Pennsylvania, where they established a mission on Christmas Eve in 1741, naming the mission in the city that would subsequently rise around it Bethlehem. Soon after, the Moravians established the towns of Nazareth, Emhouse, and Lidditz in Pennsylvania, and even had an expansion settlement in the Piedmont area of North Carolina that they called Wachovia. The Moravians actively invited Native American groups to join their church as full members, and like the Quakers, they practiced pacifism as a core belief. And a good number of Native Americans did in fact join the Moravian Church, particularly around the town of Bethlehem. But this all brought them into conflict with the English and Scots-Irish settlers in the region, particularly during and after the French and Indian War. A group of Scotch-Irish gangs calling themselves the Paxton Boys believed, quote, "The distinction between friendly and enemy Indians was invalid. All Indians were enemies and must be treated accordingly." After the Paxton Boys had massacred the entire population of the Conestoga Indian town in what came to be known as the Conestoga Massacre, a group of them rode to the town of Lidditz, shooting off a volley of shots and yelling out, "God damn you Moravians," before riding away. The minister of Lidditz wrote to authorities in Bethlehem, quote, "The Paxton group was evilly disposed toward Bethlehem." As a result, Native Americans in the area fled toward Philadelphia where they hoped to receive protection. The Paxton Boys marched on Philadelphia, and they wrote in a document called A Declaration and a Remonstrance that listed their grievance, quote, "Moravian Indians were in confederacy with our open enemies," and, quote, "Moravians at Bethlehem were, quote, corresponding with and supplying Indians, our enemies, with ammunition and giving them intelligence during the last war and this war." The Paxton Boys' march was eventually stopped just outside of Philadelphia, with their violence afterwards primarily directed toward Native Americans, with only threats toward the German settlements. This likely wasn't out of any kindness to the Paxton Boys, but more the reality that Germans made up nearly one-third of the total population of the state. English distrust also tended to grow during the Revolutionary War. Although relatively few Germans remained loyal to the British, the neutrality of the pacifist religions such as the Amish brought them under suspicion. And the British Army was largely supplemented by around 30,000 German soldiers, famously with 12,000 being specifically Hessian soldiers. By some estimates, these mercenaries made up as much as a third of the total British Army in the Revolution. But not all German immigrants were from pacifist religions. General John Peter Muhlenberg was a Lutheran pastor before becoming a colonial general, and famously said, quote, "There's a time for all things, and there's a time to preach and a time to pray. But the time for me to preach has passed away, and there's a time to fight, and that time has come now." One of George Washington's most trusted generals was General Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a former Prussian soldier implementing Prussian drills to get Washington's undisciplined army ready for the fight. He wrote to a friend in Prussia of the difficulty, quote, "You tell your soldier, do this, and he does it. I have to tell mine first, this and that is the reason why you have to do it, and then he does it." The legendary Molly Pitcher, who brought water to the soldiers and even took up arms herself where her husband was wounded, her real name was Mary Ludwig. With the war over, an estimated 5,000 of the Hessian soldiers decided to stay and continue to grow the German population. And by the 1790 census, approximately 9% of the non-slave population of the United States was of German descent, if not actively living in German-speaking communities. So many German-speaking communities existed that a petition reached the House and was endorsed by a House committee to publish federal laws in both English and German. But the largest influx was yet to come. In April of 1972, a few years after the French Revolution had begun, Austria and Prussia invaded France in support of restoring Louis XVI and his Austrian queen, Marie Antoinette, to power. This initial invasion failed and pushed the revolutionaries to go even further in their reforms, and by September, they had abolished the monarchy and set up a republic. But this new republic started off under existential threat. In addition to the invasions from Austria and Prussia, France was also at war with England and Russia, all of whom sought to break the revolution in order to restore the status quo of monarchical rule. So the French rulers decided to make sure that a return to monarchy was not going to happen. In January of 1793, Louis XVI was executed for treason. Following the execution, Spain, Portugal, Naples, Sicily, and the Netherlands also joined in against France, uniting most of their neighbors against them. The execution of Louis XVI is now seen as the starting point of what became to be known as the Reign of Terror. The leaders of the new French Republic had intended to purge royalists, but the mass execution eventually spiraled out of control to the point that the leaders of the revolution themselves, such as Robespierre, just 2 years later would find themselves on the wrong side of the guillotine. While all of this was going on, in order to fight the wars on all fronts, the new French government was forced to resort to conscription. By October 5, 1795, many French had tired of the new leadership, and Paris was rising up in revolution again, this time against the new Republic and National Assembly. The Assembly Convention Hall was surrounded, and the forces defending them were reportedly outnumbered 6-1 as they tried to maintain a perimeter to protect the leadership of the government inside. A young artillery commander named Napoleon Bonaparte called for his men to fire on the crowd and then charge. The crowd was dispersed, but 300 people lay dead. Soon after, Napoleon was appointed General-in-Chief of the Army of the Interior, and in time would rise to eventually become the Emperor of France, bringing monarchy full circle in the Revolution for a time. Napoleon was not only able to fight back the invaders on all sides, but it was able to expand the French Empire into what is much of now present-day Germany, establishing what he called the Kingdom of Westphalia, and bringing with him French laws. The Holy Roman Empire was abolished and replaced with what was called the Confederation of the Rhine. Feudalism was also abolished, and many of the religious legal restrictions were removed. But when Napoleon's invasion of Russia failed in 1812, slowly the French Empire receded until by 1815, rule fell to what was known as the German Confederation, made up of 39 separate groups. For a brief time, peace reigned, and the population exploded, thanks in part to the expansion of international trade and the introduction of New World crops such as potatoes. At the same time, this growth, combined with the end of feudalism and the introduction of new ideas in terms of social mobility, fundamentally changed the expectations of the people of the region. But at the same time, obligations to the state also changed. Because of the invasion, new laws were created allowing governments to conscript young men into military service for between 3 and 7 years during peacetime, and potentially even longer for times of war. Growing population also meant land shortages and even land seizures in Germany. This was all contrasted by the cheap land and relatively strong property rights, and a huge need for new labor in America as it expanded west. Because of this, young men with either skills or means found themselves looking to go to America. German immigrants who were brought over for labor work on the canals and road systems often found themselves in the Midwest after they completed the projects with enough money to buy land, and so they began to settle into German-speaking communities there. While the potato blight of 1845 didn't hit Germany as hard as it hit Ireland, it was combined with a weak rye harvest around the same time and rising food prices generally. By 1848, revolutionary movements had begun to grow, and they were calling for German unification under a democratic system which would guarantee basic human rights for citizens. On March 18, 1848, hundreds died in a street protest in Berlin. 10 days later, the Prussian king rode through the city wearing a black, red, and gold armband, the colors of the revolution. He agreed to hold a national assembly and to create a constitution in order to address the grievances. But what emerged was the King of Prussia installing a system where votes were based on the amount of taxes paid, meaning roughly 4% of the citizens controlled roughly 82% of the voting seats, and many of the rights were all tied to military service, including the right to emigrate. The Constitution also failed to separate powers. It gave the king full control of the military and left the king huge flexibility in terms of using emergency powers. In practice, the new laws gave the state more power to act aggressively against dissent. In many areas, this led to more authoritarian rule designed to maintain control and order as opposed to any of the goals of the revolution to gain more freedom for the average German. And so, now even more Germans looked to escape political backlash and conscription laws. But now, with the new laws, they understood that when they left, they would need to go far enough away to be outside of the reach of authorities in the German Confederacy. And so America became one of the primary destinations. This specific wave of immigrants became known as the 48ers. These immigrants tended to settle in newly expanding settlements in the Midwest and South, where huge amounts of land had been acquired during the Mexican-American War, which had vastly expanded the total land area of the United States. Between 1820 and 1860, over 1.5 million Germans immigrated to the United States. The United States only had a population of around 31 million people as of the 1860 census, likely less than the population of all of the German Confederacy, and this again was adding on to the already existing 9% German population at the founding. Approximately 30,000 German settlers settled in Cincinnati specifically in an area that came to be known as Over the Rhine. Other large groups of settlers went to places like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Chicago, Illinois, and Omaha, Nebraska, where they established large German-speaking communities. In Louisville, Kentucky, over one-third of the population were German or German-speaking around 1850. Baltimore also tended to be a major hub of German immigration, with one census showing just prior to the Civil War over 32,000 residents of Baltimore were born in Germany. So many Germans came to Texas that an entire separate dialect that came to be known as Texas German emerged. Much of this immigration actually preceded Texas becoming a state, and when Texas did finally become a state, German was given equal status to Spanish. Many came through the port of Galveston, with groups migrating into central Texas, creating what came to be known as the German Belt. Freedmen colonies sometimes emerged near the German immigrants in Texas, as the Germans tended to oppose slavery and be more sympathetic. So interweaved with these communities that the black freedmen would often be bilingual or just speak German. This created a subgroup known as the Black Texas Germans. But this mass immigration didn't come without backlash, particularly for German Catholics, who were often attacked alongside Irish Catholics by gangs associated with the Know Nothing Party. In August of 1855, a mob of Protestants attacked Irish and Catholic neighborhoods in Louisville, Kentucky, in an event that came to be known as Bloody Monday. They burned homes and businesses and killing dozens. Similar riots broke out in Baltimore and New Orleans in 1856 and 1858, respectively. When the Civil War broke out, Germans were the largest ethnic group in the Union, with about 200,000 native-born and 250,000 first-generation Germans. Conversely, while there were several Confederate general officers from Ireland, England, and even France, only one German-born soldier reached the rank of colonel. In Texas, around 30 Germans were killed by Confederate forces while fleeing to the Union-controlled New Orleans to resist conscription in what was now called the Nueces Massacre. During the Baltimore draft riots of 1861, the German-language newspaper was destroyed by a pro-secession mob. In the border state of Missouri, tensions between pro-Union Germans and pro-slavery Missourians led to riot in St. Louis. Mostly German forces had captured a group of pro-secessionist militiamen after they attempted to occupy a nearby fort to give supplies to the Confederacy. While the German soldiers were releasing the secessionist militiamen, the mob threw rocks at the soldiers while shouting, "Damn the Dutch!" A gunshot rang out from the crowd, fatally wounding a Union captain. The Union soldiers then opened fire, and at least 28 were killed, with more than 75 wounded, leading to days of unrest in the city. But even with the Civil War in America raging, the situation in Germany wasn't that much better, and soon would become even worse. In 1862, Otto von Bismarck was elected as Chancellor. In a speech he gave on September 30th, 1862, he made clear his distaste for the reforms proposed by the revolutionaries of 1848, calling for German unification and expanded military budget. He famously said during the speech, quote, "Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849. But by iron and blood." Bismarck used loopholes to continue to collect taxes and increase military spending even without the approval of the Assembly, and he had plans to put that newly funded military to use soon. In 1864, Prussia and Austria invaded Denmark and occupied contested territory. When Prussia and Austria couldn't agree on what to do with the land they had taken from Denmark, they themselves engaged war. This short but bloody war involved one of the largest scale battles in history up to that point, the Battle of Königgrätz. Both sides reportedly fielded armies in excess of 200,000 men, with some estimates of the total number on the battlefield that day reaching nearly 500,000. Prussia suffered some over 9,000 casualties, but the Austrian side's casualties were over 30,000, with some estimates as high as 40,000, all in a single day. In July of 1870, France attempted to take back control over parts of Germany. The Prussian army not only soundly defeated them, but counterattacked, being able to capture Napoleon III and over 100,000 French troops following the Battle of Sedan in early September. Soon after, the Prussians began a siege of Paris, and by October, the Prussians occupied the city. So defeated were the French and so emboldened were the Prussians that in a ceremony at Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors, Bismarck convinced King Wilhelm of Prussia to proclaim himself the Emperor or Kaiser of the German Empire and dissolve the German Confederation. This new empire was declared to be the Second Reich, being the successor to the Holy Roman Empire. As part of the agreement for peace, the Prussians were allowed a victory parade through Paris, and they forced the French to pay the identical amount Napoleon had forced the Germans to pay when he had invaded years before, adjusted for inflation. In 1871, Bismarck called for, quote, Kulturkampf against German Catholics. He abolished the Catholic department in the Ministry of Culture, and over a 7-year period, all of the Catholic bishops in Prussia and many priests were either imprisoned or exiled, including all members of the Jesuit order. He implemented a Germanization effort against non-German speakers, as the empire included Danish, Polish, and French-speaking regions after the expansion. He was particularly brutal toward the Polish, of whom he wrote, quote, in a private letter, "Hammer the Poles until they despair of living. I have all the sympathy in the world for their situation, but if we want to exist, we have no choice but to wipe them out. Wolves are only what God made them, but we shoot them all the same when we can get at them." Even in public, his position was clear. He wrote to a Prussian foreign minister, quote, "Every success of the Polish national movement is a defeat for Prussia. We cannot carry on the fight against this element according to the rules of civil justice, but only in accordance with the rules of war." Bismarck was also particularly hostile to a growing socialist movement in government, calling the, quote, enemy of the Reich. Following assassination attempts on Kaiser Wilhelm, he was able to pass laws outlawing trade unions and suppressing socialist newspapers. At the same time, he always sought to ally himself with the working class. He argued for what he called, quote, practical Christianity, which he described in a speech by saying, quote, the whole problem is rooted in the question, does the state have the responsibility to care for its helpless fellow citizens, or does it not? I maintain that it does have this duty, and to be sure, not simply the Christian state, as I have once permitted myself to allude with the words practical Christianity, but rather the state by its very nature. German nationalist-based anti-Semitic ideas also began to grow during this time, notably with the publication of a widely circulated propaganda pamphlet by William Marr in 1879, entitled The Victory of Judaism over Germanism from a Non-Confessional Standpoint. With all of these cultural crackdowns, even more people found themselves at risk in Germany and sought to emigrate. Between 1860 and 1890, nearly 3 million German immigrants came to America. In 1888, after the death of his father and brother in quick succession, the 29-year-old Wilhelm II became Kaiser. By 1890, he had forced out Bismarck in order to take more personal control of the empire. He sought to expand the German military even beyond Bismarck's goals, in particular expanding the navy. Wilhelm was the grandson of Queen Victoria through his mother, and he seemed to have a lifelong fixation with competing with the English, and particularly in asserting power of both Germany and himself in world affairs. Wilhelm famously gave a speech in 1900 to troops being sent to China to fight in the Boxer River Wars, telling them, quote, if you come before the enemy, he will be defeated. No quarter will be given, prisoners will not be taken. Whoever falls into your hands is forfeited. Just as 1,000 years ago the Huns under their King Etzel made a name for themselves, one that even today makes them seem mighty in history and legend, so may the name Germany be affirmed by you in such a way that in China no Chinese will ever dare look cross-eyed at a German. The troops appear to take the instruction to heart. One soldier wrote in his diary, quote, it was not long before His Majesty appeared. He made a stirring speech to us, of which I only remember the following words, no prisoners will be taken, no quarter will be given, any Chinese who fall into your hands. Following this, reports of abuse sent home by soldiers were often published in some newspapers as, quote, Hun letters. While he was less bloodthirsty toward European rivals, his ambition to make Germany be seen as a true great power, combined with a sharp elbow diplomacy that increased tensions with other European rivals, particularly in France and England. In 1908, Wilhelm gave a radio interview with the intended purpose of reducing tensions between the French, Russians, and English, but it had the opposite effect, as he implied the French and Russians were trying to get Germany to intervene against England, instead of the English, quote, you English are mad, mad, mad as March hares. What has come over you that you are so completely given over to suspicions quite unworthy of a great nation? What more can I do than I have done? I declared with all the emphasis at my command in my speech at Guildhall that my heart is set upon peace, and that it is one of my dearest wishes to live on the best terms with England. Have I ever been false to my word? Falsehood and provocation are alien to my nature. My actions ought to speak for themselves, but you listen not to them, but those who misinterpret and distort them. That is a personal insult which I feel and resent. Around the same time as the interview was given, a series of scandals emerged, making allegations of homosexuality both in the high levels of the military and among Wilhelm's closest advisors. At least 6 military officers reportedly committed suicide as a result of blackmail, and 20 others were court-martialed on accusations of engaging in homosexual behavior. The scandal involved specific allegations against a man who was arguably the most trusted advisor of Wilhelm, Philip, Prince of Eulenburg. The scandals only escalated with the death of the chief of the German Imperial Military Cabinet, who reportedly had a heart attack while performing dressed in a tutu for the Kaiser and his guests during a hunting retreat. Likely as a result of all of these scandals, Wilhelm reportedly had a nervous breakdown. Many historians have argued that the scandal led to a change in German leadership, which allowed more military aggressive generals to expand their influence. Germany's continuing alienation of France and Russia on either side of them had driven those two powers into an alliance with each other against German expansion. In response, Germany tightened their alliances with their neighbors to the south, Austria and Hungary, who had themselves formed an alliance as a single entity under a single ruler, calling themselves Austria-Hungary. It was in this framework, on June 28, 1914, that the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by Serbian dissidents. Wilhelm considered Ferdinand to be a friend and offered a more or less blank check of support for them to respond against Serbia, who was at the time allied with Russia, and therefore also France. Weeks passed while all sides waited to see how Austria would respond and if it would invade Serbia in retaliation. On July 23rd, Austria issued an ultimatum to Serbia, requiring they allow an inquiry into the assassination, cease all anti-Austrian propaganda, and root out the anti-Austrian terrorist organizations within its borders. Less than 48 hours later, Serbian officials wrote back that they were willing to accept the majority of the demands, with the exception of allowing Austrian-Hungarian officials to conduct the investigations within Serbian territory, as that would violate their sovereignty and constitution. Wilhelm, after reading the response, reportedly wrote next to it in the margins, quote, "A brilliant solution, and in barely 48 hours. This is more than could have been expected. A great moral victory for Vienna, but with it, every pretext for war falls to the ground, and Giesel had better stay quietly at Belgrade. On this document, I should never have given orders for mobilization. But the German generals did not agree. One wrote, quote, "Unfortunately peaceful news. The Kaiser wants peace. He even wants to influence Austria and to stop continuing further." It was during this time that generals came to Wilhelm and said that he, quote, "no longer had control of the affair in his own hands," and strongly implied that if he continued to seek peace, he would be replaced by his more hawkish son. The British offered to mediate, but the German ambassador was only humoring them in an attempt to keep them neutral when the war broke out. This was unsuccessful. On August 28th, when Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia, World War I began. Russia, France, and England lined up on one side, Germany and Austria-Hungary on the other, eventually joined by the Ottoman Empire. In America in 1914, most Americans simply wished to stay out of the war entirely. German Americans generally urged neutrality, but as the war continued, events such as the sinking of the British ocean liner, the Lusitania, by German submarines began to shift public sentiment. As the war dragged on in Europe, leaders in the U.S. believed it was inevitable that the U.S. would find itself dragged into the war, and began growing infrastructure and planning accordingly. This also led to a discussion of loyalty in America. In 1915, former President Teddy Roosevelt gave a speech at Carnegie Hall where he said, quote, "There is no room in this country for hyphenated Americanism. When I refer to hyphenated Americans, I do not refer to naturalized Americans. Some of the very best Americans I have ever known are naturalized Americans, Americans born abroad. But a hyphenated American is not an American at all. The one absolutely certain way of bringing this nation to ruin, of preventing all possibility of its continuing to be a nation of all, would be to permit it to become a tangle of squabbling nationalities, an intricate knot of German Americans, Irish Americans, English Americans, French Americans, Scandinavian Americans, or Italian Americans, each preserving its separate nationality, each at heart feeling more sympathy with Europeans of that nationality than with the other citizens of the American Republic. There is no such thing as a hyphenated American who is a good American. The only man who is a good American is the man who is an American and nothing else." In January of 1917, a diplomatic telegram was intercepted where Germany had promised Mexico return of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if they allied with Germany should the U.S. enter the war on the side of the Allies. At that point, leaders began to openly question German-American loyalty. As America entered the war, President Woodrow Wilson passed laws adding restrictions to, quote, "German-born male citizens of the United States over the age of 14, even if they were now citizens." About 250,000 people were required to register at a post office and carry a registration card at all times, and notify the government of any change of address or employment. On April 18, 1918, these regulations were expanded to women. While these regulations were in place, about 6,300 people were arrested, with over 2,000 incarcerated for the duration of the war at several military bases across the United States. These cases were handled by the Enemy Alien Registration Department within the Department of Justice. This department was run by a then 22-year-old J. Edgar Hoover. 29 of the detainees were members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, after it was alleged falsely that they had refused to play the Star-Spangled Banner. German music was banned in many cities, and as a result, many musicians ended up being detained. So many musicians were detained, they were able to hold concerts with over 100 musicians. One of them wrote, "The Eroica rushed at us and carried us far away and above war and worry and barbed wire." In addition to the full-time residents who were detained, about 1,800 German merchant marines were detained as well. The Justice Department began compiling a list of, quote, "German aliens," getting the list to 480,000 people. A federal law was passed requiring all subjects of, quote, "enemy governments" to turn over their guns, ammunitions, explosives, or other similar articles. The Red Cross barred anyone with a German last name from joining out of fear of sabotage. In Wisconsin, a German language professor was tarred and feathered. A German immigrant named Robert Prager was taken into police custody for his own protection after a mob came to his home and made him walk barefoot down Main Street in Collinsville, Illinois, draped in an American flag. After being put in the cell, a drunken mob returned and pulled him from the cell, beating him while forcing him to sing patriotic songs and kiss the flag. He was allowed to write a brief note to his parents. The note read, quote, "Dear parents, I must on this, the 4th day of April, 1918, die. Please pray for me, my dear parents." He was then murdered by hanging in front of the crowd shortly after midnight. 11 people were charged, but all were acquitted. A local paper wrote an editorial, quote, "Outside of a few persons who may still harbor Germanic inclinations, the whole city is glad that the 11 men indicted for the hanging of Robert P. Prager were acquitted." The article went on to say, quote, "The city does not miss him. The lesson of his death has had a wholesome effect on the Germanists of Collinsville and the rest of the nation." Books published in German were removed from libraries and sometimes burned. In many places, sauerkraut came to be called Liberty cabbage, hamburgers became Liberty sandwiches or Liberty steaks, and Dachshunds became Liberty pups. Even German measles became referred to as Liberty measles. President Woodrow Wilson appointed A. Mitchell Palmer as, quote, alien property custodian, and empowered him to seize property from anyone suspected of hindering the war effort, including interned Germans. Palmer wrote, quote, all aliens interned by the government are regarded as enemies and their property is treated accordingly. Palmer described his agency as, quote, the biggest general store in the country, and that his group had taken control of companies that were involved in, quote, pencil making in New Jersey, chocolate manufacturing in Connecticut, and beer brewing in Chicago. Palmer estimated that he had seized and was managing well over $500 million in assets, or over $10 billion in 2024 money. After the war came to an end, Palmer announced the seized assets would be, quote, Americanized by being sold out from under their German owners. The most famous example of this was when the chemical company Bayer was auctioned, including its U.S. patent for aspirin. Around the same time, Woodrow Wilson said in his final major speech, quote, any man who carries a hyphen around with him carries a dagger that he is ready to plunge into the vitals of the Republic whenever he is ready. It wasn't until 7 months after the armistice was signed that interned prisoners began to receive release notices. The last interned prisoner wasn't released until April of 1920, more than a year and a half after the end of the war. History is awkward.